Warning: this is a true crime and horror genre channel and is not for the faint of heart, minor-aged individuals, or the easily impressionable. This video will contain details that some viewers may find highly disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned.
Oh, my most beloved and murderous horde, welcome back. I am, of course, your mistress of murder, Sam Kempo, and of course you all have met my little companion, Charlie. Say hello, Charlie. Today's video is going to be another gory one for sure, but in a slightly different way. You see, when we tend to think of the personification of innocence, the image that tends to come to mind is that of a happy and smiling child, usually one that's very young, perhaps under the age of 10. It seems to be almost human nature to want to believe that there is at least one thing of complete purity in this horribly dark and corrupt world we live in. However, as this video will soon reveal, perhaps Miss Pat Benatar had a point when she made her very catchy song, Hell is for Children, and after going through this list, I can't help but agree. And perhaps the goddess of Nordic mythology, Hell of the Underworld, certainly does have a place in her eternal torture chambers for these particular children. For my horde, this video I present to you is the top 15 list of the most horrific crimes ever committed by children. You know the drill by now, my lovelies. Pick your poison, sit back, relax, and let's have ourselves a little conversation. Number 15 is Lionel Tate. Now, Lionel is much older than he was at the time of his crime, but Lionel is believed to be one of the youngest boys ever sentenced to life in prison without parole for the brutal murder of a 6-year-old girl. The young girl was named Tiffany and was found dead in the home of Lionel Tate after his mother agreed to babysit the girl. At first, no one was sure why the child had not been found breathing in their home, but 2 days later, an autopsy proved that there might be a sinister reason for her death. The results showed that the young girl had suffered fractures to her skull, as well as a lot of internal bruising. Lionel claimed that he was only been wrestling playfully with Tiffany, but the jury didn't buy it. After being convicted to life in prison, he was eventually granted a new trial and was given short terms of house arrest and probation. Number 14 was actually a 13-year-old girl who had her entire family killed. Now, if you found out that your 13-year-old daughter wanted to hang out with her 23-year-old boyfriend, you probably wouldn't permit it, right? I know I certainly wouldn't. Now, what would you do if you knew the result of you not allowing her to do so would be your murder? Unfortunately, this was the case for a family of a young girl from Alberta. The girl had had an ongoing relationship with the older man. Now, obviously, because of their age differences, many problems occurred. The two would often joke about killing the girl's family, but she claimed she was never serious about it. One night, it did in fact become reality when the man came over to her house, and he then killed her mother and father and urged the young girl to stab her younger brother. She did so, but was unable to finish the job, so he finished him off for her. Now, the girl wasn't tried as an adult, as she didn't actually commit any of the murders. Aiding, however, was still enough to have her sentenced to prison until she reached the age of 18, with years of supervision after. Number 13 was the act of 3 young Chicago boys, unfortunately, who assaulted a woman. Now, Chicago, to most of the world, is seen as a very violent place. Now, me, having lived around there and been around there for a while, I can't say I agree to that, though there are some areas that even the most seasoned locals wouldn't tread. It does have a high murder rate, but then again, most large cities do. But even still, it's really not a surprise to hear about a shooting on the daily basis. But this crime, committed by some Chicago criminals, wasn't a gang-related shooting like most tend to be. These 3 young boys were the ages of 12, 15, and 16, who broke into a woman's house in a quiet neighborhood while she was sleeping one night on the south side of Chicago. They first broke through an open window to rob the apartment, but upon finding the woman sleeping, they decided to do something much more sinister. Each of the 3 boys took turns raping the 30-year-old woman in her own bed, while the other 2 boys held a gun to her. The young woman's young son slept in the room just next to her. Luckily, all 3 boys were arrested and were tried as adults. The poor victim thankfully lived, but she'll probably have a hard time finding peace in her home ever again. Now, personally, as I have been around the Chicago area, this was not a crime that was known to me until today. Number 12 is Sara Madrid, who was shot by her 12-year-old son. Now, we've all had times when our parents told us what to do and it has made us mad. No one likes to do the dishes or to clean the room, but we still have to do what is asked of us. Well, one child thought he had the ultimate way of getting out of doing chores, by shooting his mother. The boy was taught how to use a gun by his mother's boyfriend in case of emergencies. Now, while I am all for teaching children gun safety, this is an unfortunate event even to me, as instead of using it only for safety, he used it against his own mother because he did not feel like doing the chores she asked him to do. It was later discovered that the young boy was often subject to physical and verbal abuse from his mother, who slapped him only moments before being shot by him. The boy was tried as a child, and many believe his abuse led to the incident that occurred, as well as that he will have the ability to be rehabilitated whilst imprisoned. Number 11 is that of Christopher Pittman. Now, Christopher Pittman was a young 12-year-old boy who was convicted of murdering his grandparents while they slept. The matter of the case was what made it very disturbing. Christopher was a troubled child who had issues with anger and depression. After he made an attempt to run away, he was put on an antidepressant to help with his behavior. Now, unfortunately, some antidepressants are not made for the consumption of children. In fact, if you have ever taken antidepressants, like many I know, it actually does have some very horrific side effects. In fact, suicide or suicidal thoughts or actions is actually a symptom of taking antidepressants. Rather ironically, if you ask me. Now, after having an argument at school and later with his grandparents, Christopher murdered his grandmother and grandfather while they slept. He then took the gun, his dog, some cash, and set fire to the house with a candle. He claimed that a large man had kidnapped him, but later confessed that he actually did murder them. Christopher's defense claimed that the use of the antidepressant Zoloft made him commit his crimes. He is still convicted of murder and has been sentenced to 25 years in prison. Number 10 is that by one Aryan Lawhorn. Now, the case of Aryan is quite disturbing. At the time of his crime, he was only about 12 years old when he chose a random victim on the playground to stab and kill. He in fact chose 9-year-old Connor, who he hadn't known who he was at the time. After he stabbed Connor, he simply asked to borrow someone's cell phone and called the police himself. When asked why he had chosen to commit the crime, he claimed that it was because he wanted to get arrested and sentenced to death. He simply no longer wanted to live anymore. It was discovered that he was subject to a lot of physical and mental abuse from his mother and stepfather, and that he had often talked about wanting to die. He will now sit behind bars in a juvenile correction center and be put up again for trial when he turns 18. Number 9 is that of Jordan Brown. Now, Jordan Brown was only 11 years old when he opened fire on his soon-to-be stepmother. At the time of her murder, she was also pregnant with Jordan's future half-brother. After he murdered his father's fiancée while she slept, Jordan boarded the school bus like it was any other morning. Apparently, Jordan was heard before the murder stating that he would like to shoot his future stepmom and the woman's daughters. Unfortunately, it was one of the woman's daughters who found her dead in her bedroom. The baby inside her died as well, unfortunately, and family members claimed that Jordan was a troubled child who had anger issues. His father maintained his son's innocence throughout the trial, claiming that someone else had to have committed the crime. Many suspect that Jordan was jealous of the new baby and the new marriage, so that was his motive for the incredibly gruesome murder. Number 8 is that of Andrew Golden and Mitchell Johnson. Now, Mitchell Johnson, age 11, and his 13-year-old friend Andrew Golden were just middle school students when they decided to open fire on their classmates. They loaded up a car with supplies and weapons stolen from their parents. They went to school like any normal day and pulled the fire alarm. Then everyone lined up outside in proper protocol for a fire. It was there that Mitchell and Andrew opened fire on their classmates waiting outside. They killed several teachers and students, as well as injuring many in the process. They both attempted to flee the scene, but were instead caught. They were both tried as adults, both becoming released from prison when they turned 18. Golden has gone to live a fairly normal life while trying to maintain his anonymity. Johnson, however, is still in prison, as he was arrested and charged several times after being released for various crimes. We've heard of plenty of school shootings in our time, but when it comes from an 11 and 13-year-old, it can be quite the extra bit of unsettling. Number 7 is a Miss Marybelle. Now, Marybelle is one of the most infamous children on this list, as she is known for being one of the first famous or infamous child murderers. She is responsible for murdering 2 different young boys within a 3-month time span. Both children were murdered with her bare hands. The second time, a 13-year-old accomplice had aided her. The murders took place in the 60s, and since then Mary has been released from prison and has had a daughter. The nature of her crimes was quite brutal, as after Mary strangled the second child, she went back to carve her initials into the stomach of the boy. She also mutilated different body parts of him, including the genitalia. It is very interesting to imagine how she could be right now and what she thinks of her vicious crimes. Does she feel remorse every day, or has she been able to move on and forget her own brutal past? Our next story, number 6, is that of a 10 and 11-year-old boy who beat 2 other children. 2 Yorkshire boys subjected 2 other younger boys to brutal torture and abuse on a playground. Now, during the trial, the 2 perpetrators claimed that the only reason they stopped the brutal treatment was because their arms were tired. The 2 victims were walking together when they were stopped by the Yorkshire Boys. They were then robbed, beaten with bricks and bits of glass, and forced to perform sexual acts with the 10 and 11-year-old criminals. The boys stopped after claiming it had went on long enough, and that their arms were very tired. Luckily, the 2 had stopped in time for the 2 victims to be able to escape and live. The criminals were immediately arrested, and was soon learned that the boys were actually from various foster homes. The boys had a history of beating up other children, but until now, it had never gotten this far. Number 5 is that of a 9-year-old girl who stabbed her playmate. A 9-year-old girl had once actually stabbed her 11-year-old playmate in the chest, killing her. The two were playing together when the mother of the 9-year-old had stepped out to borrow something from a neighbor. When she returned, she found 11-year-old Queen Washington with a knife stuck in her chest. Apparently, the fight was over a ball and had quickly escalated into murder. People around the area who knew the young girl claimed that she was a very troubled child, some even describing her as a bit of a thug. The murder took place in 2005, and because of the laws that protect the identity of children, it is hard to know for sure whether her whereabouts are now known or even what her name is. Unfortunately, cases like these are difficult as many children have fights without getting into legal trouble. But not many children stab their playmates either. Number 4 is that of an 8-year-old boy who shot his father and his father's friend. Now, these gruesome murders from an 8-year-old boy shocked the public. The 8-year-old boy took a .22 caliber handgun and shot and killed his father as well as his father's friends. The case was very unsettling as the motive remains a bit unclear. At first, many suspected that there was abuse involved. They found records that the young boy kept of how many spankings his father had given him. This was only an indication of any sort of abuse in the household, though. When the boy gave his confession as to why he did it, he stated that he saw that his father was suffering and didn't want him to suffer anymore. Though, really, there's nothing to say as to why the boy thought his father was suffering. The boy was not sentenced to life, but rather to a treatment facility to track and monitor his behavior. In cases involving such young children, it can be hard to determine what actions to take for punishment. Number 3 is Diedrich Owens. Now, we've already heard about some disturbing cases of young boys who brought guns to school, but this one is even worse. Diedrich Owens decided to take a gun and a knife to school when he was only 6 years old. There, he pulled out a gun on another 6-year-old, Kayla Rowland, who I have the picture above, fatally shooting her. But before he shot her, he stated that he didn't like her. He only shot her in the arm, but it hit a major artery, which resulted in her death. He ended up not being charged, as anyone under the age of 7 cannot be held responsible for murder, at least in the United States. His father was charged with manslaughter and served a short prison term for allowing Diedrich to have easy access to the gun. We do have to wonder, is it okay that he did not serve any time in juvenile court for the murder? What was going on in this boy's head when this happened? All of these questions and many, many more still to this day go unknown. Number 2 is a young Saudi boy who shot his father at only 4 years old. Now, one of the craziest cases on this list involves that of a 4-year-old with a gun. Now, I don't have to make it any more clear that firearm safety and being a responsible owner of a firearm is essential, especially when you have children. We often hear of many cases that involve children getting a hold of a gun and accidentally shooting it off, sometimes injuring another person or even accidentally killing someone. However, in this case, this was no accident. Because of protective laws, the name of the child cannot be released. However, we do know that this brutal crime did occur in Saudi Arabia. Before going to the store, a young boy asked his father to buy him a new PlayStation. The father, like any normal adult, did not immediately give in to his child's demands. After the father returned home empty-handed, the child grew angry that he didn't get what he wanted. He then found his father's gun and shot him to death. A crime like this is quite tragic, but obviously the child isn't capable of knowing how serious his crime was, or perhaps he was. Yet, one must think what drove him to think it was okay for him to handle a gun. Our last on the list, number 1, is that of Robert Thompson and John Venables. The murder that Robert Thompson and John Venables committed has to be the most brutal crime on this list, if not in history. The two look like such innocent children in their pictures, but in reality they committed more gruesome crimes than most adults are even capable of. The victim was 2-year-old James Burglar, who was then taken by the two while shopping with his mother. Robert and John then took the boy to a secluded area, threw paint in his eyes, beat him with bricks and stones, forced batteries into his mouth, and then dropped a 22-pound iron onto his head. The 2-year-old suffered over 40 injuries in total. After murdering the innocent boy, the two then placed him on the train tracks, hoping that many would assume that it was the train that caused the incident. The train did in fact slice the boy in half, though autopsies revealed the traumas he suffered beforehand. Robert and John only served short terms since they were each only about 10 years old at the time. Since being released, Robert has remained his privacy with a new identity. However, John has been in and out of prison ever since. And that, my dearest ones, is all the time I have for you today. I do hope you so enjoyed our little conversation. And until next time, my lovelies, blessed be, and stay classy.